You hear the leather before you see it. The slow creak of straps tightening against polished wood, the shallow gasp of someone trying not to scream. Your wrists are bound behind you, shoulders wrenched backward at an angle that makes breathing difficult. The curve of the wooden frame presses into your ribs. You cannot stand, you cannot kneel. You can only hang there, suspended in agony that leaves no marks. This is not a battlefield. This is a bedroom. And the man watching you suffer is your husband. Before we dive deeper into this, I have to ask, where are you watching from? It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, from an empire that fell over a millennium ago, can connect us across continents right now. Rome, 1st century BCE, in the sprawling villas that lined the Palatine Hill. Behind marble columns and perfumed gardens, a new kind of violence was taking shape. It wasn't designed for criminals or enemies of the state. It was engineered specifically for women who forgot their place. The device had no official name at first, no imperial decree introducing it to the world. It emerged quietly, passed between households like a dark secret, recommended in whispered conversations between patrician men who shared a common problem, wives who spoke when they should have stayed silent. The earliest surviving reference comes from a physician's notes dated 89 BCE, discovered in fragments near Pompeii. He describes treating a noblewoman for postural distress and shoulder displacement, consistent with prolonged restraint. He does not name the device. He does not need to. By then, everyone in Rome's upper circles knew what it meant when a woman limped for days after a private evening with her husband. The machine was elegant in its cruelty. Crafted from curved wood, usually oak or cypress, it resembled a barrel split lengthwise, smooth and deceptively benign. Leather straps were anchored at strategic points: wrists, thighs, neck, ankles. When a woman was bound to it, her body was forced into an arch that stressed every joint simultaneously. The genius of its design was that it broke nothing. No bones snapped, no skin tore. It simply made the body betray itself, muscle by muscle, hour by hour. Her name appears in only 3 historical texts, and in 2 of them it's been scratched out. But court records from 87 BCE mention a Julia Victrix, not Vittoria. That was a later corruption brought before a magistrate on charges of disturbing household order. The charges were filed by her husband, a senator named Marcus Flavius. The details are sparse, but what remains is chilling. Julia had refused to drink a medicinal preparation her husband insisted would correct her: temperament. When she asked what was in it, he struck her. When she told the household slaves what he'd done, he commissioned something new. The carpenter who built the first version left no name, but his craftsmanship survives in detailed sketches archived in the Capitoline Museum. The device was a masterwork of engineering disguised as furniture. To an uninformed observer, it might have looked like an ornate cradle or a piece of decorative sculpture. But every curve was calculated, every strap placement tested. The goal was not immediate pain, but accumulating torture, the kind that makes a woman reconsider every word she's ever spoken. Julia was bound to it for 6 hours on the first night. By the 3rd hour, her shoulders had begun to dislocate partially. By the 5th, she was hallucinating from the pain. But according to the magistrate's record, she did not apologize. She did not beg. When they finally released her, she collapsed, unable to walk. And when her husband leaned down to ask if she had learned her lesson, witnesses say she spat blood at his feet and smiled. That smile changed everything. Within weeks, Marcus Flavius wasn't hiding what he'd done. He was bragging about it. At bathhouses and banquets, he described the device in lavish detail to other senators, many of whom had their own difficult wives. He brought sketches. He invited men to his villa to see it in person. One senator, Publius Cornelius, commissioned his own version immediately. Another asked if modifications could be made for smaller frames for younger women. The market for marital discipline had found its product. But something unexpected happened, something no lawmaker, no philosopher, no jealous husband had anticipated. As the device spread through Rome's wealthiest households, it ceased to be a private matter, no longer confined to whispered punishments behind shuttered doors. The spectacle was too compelling, the imbalance of power too intoxicating for those who witnessed it. Rome, after all, was a civilization that turned everything into performance war, death, even dinner. Soon men began inviting other men to watch. What had originated as an instrument of domestic discipline transformed into a new form of social theater. By 85 BCE, these private viewings had become fashionable among certain elite circles, senators, generals, wealthy equestrians, anyone who enjoyed the thrill of dominance disguised as tradition. A wife would be brought into the triclinium, or the garden atrium, sometimes veiled, sometimes displayed with ceremonial precision. She would be bound to the device, and the guests would observe as if attending a chariot race or a legal debate. They drank wine. They placed bets on how long she could endure before breaking. They commented on her breathing, her posture, the trembling of her muscles, discussing her form and resistance, as if she were an animal at auction or a horse being broken for the first time. The language surrounding it changed as well. Rome was a master of renaming cruelty until it sounded like virtue. It was no longer called torture. That word was vulgar, unsophisticated, beneath the dignity of educated men. Instead, they spoke of correction, of posture training, of behavioral sculpture. Physicians, eager to gain favor with the aristocracy, began writing medical treatises on its supposed benefits. Some claimed the unnatural contortion could realign a woman's humors. Others insisted it could restore domestic harmony, as if obedience were the same as peace. One particularly disturbing text from 83 BCE, attributed to a Greek physician practicing in Rome, describes the device as therapeutic and recommends its use for women suffering from excessive independence of thought. The phrase, historians agree, is not metaphorical. Julia Victrix appears one more time in the surviving records, and it is the most chilling entry of all. In 84 BCE, she was summoned to a gathering at the home of a prominent consul. Not as a guest, she was no longer considered capable of having opinions worth hearing, but as a demonstration. Her husband had been paid handsomely to bring her to showcase her transformation, to prove how effectively the device had reformed her. Rome admired results, even horrifying ones. According to a letter preserved in a private collection in Florence, Julia arrived, carried in a litter, dressed in silks, dyed with costly Tyrian purple. Her face was painted white in the style of aristocratic Roman women, her hair braided with gold wire. She walked into the atrium without resistance, as if she were entering a temple rather than a spectacle. And then, in full view of Rome's most powerful men, she mounted the device herself. There was no struggle, no hesitation, only silence. The leather straps tightened, the servants stepped back. The guests leaned forward, waiting. The room held its breath, anticipating the familiar sounds: pain, pleading, surrender. Instead, Julia began to laugh. Not a nervous giggle meant to shield fear, not a broken sob disguised as humor, but a full, resonant, impossible laugh that echoed through the marble hall, rising toward the painted ceiling like smoke from a ritual fire. The witnesses froze, confused. Some laughed with her, uneasy and uncertain whether they were expected to find it amusing. Others grew angry, demanding she be silenced, calling for her husband to control his wife. But Julia did not stop. Even as her body arched backward, even as the strain in her shoulders grew unbearable, the laughter poured out of her. She laughed until she struggled to breathe, and then she laughed through the gasping. Her face contorted not by pain, but by something far more terrifying to those who watched: defiance. Absolute, unbreakable defiance. And in that moment, Rome, so certain of its power, did not know what it had created. One guest, a young scribe named Gaius Lentulus, wrote about it years later in his personal journals. He said the sound was the most terrifying thing he'd ever heard, not because it was mad, but because it was sane. She was laughing at them, at the device, at the entire architecture of power that thought it could break a human being into obedience with wood and leather. When they finally unbound her hours later, she stood on shaking legs, turned to the crowd, and said 7 words that were repeated in whispers for years: "This is the best you could do." After that night, Julia Victrix disappears from history. No death record, no mention in her husband's will, no gravestone, but the device that was built to silence her became infamous. The consul's guests talked, the story spread, and within a year, something shifted in Rome's appetite for cruelty. The device moved from private villas into public spaces. Not the grand Colosseum that would come later, but smaller arenas on the outskirts of the city where crowds gathered for cheaper, raw entertainment. They no longer used noblewomen, of course. That would have been scandalous. Instead, they bound slaves, accused criminals, women convicted of adultery or blasphemy. The charge didn't matter. The spectacle did. By 80 BCE, the disciplinaria, as it was now officially called, had become a regular feature at public exhibitions. Crowds would gather to watch women bound to the device, their endurance measured in hours, their suffering narrated by announcers who described every tremor, every sob, every moment of collapse, as if it were a sporting event. Vendors sold food, children watched. Philosophers debated whether the punishment was just or merely entertaining. A graffito found in Pompeii, dating to around 75 BCE, shows a crude drawing of the device with the words "Victrix laughed here" scratched beneath it. Someone remembered, someone wanted others to know. The device evolved. Craftsmen added refinements, iron reinforcements for durability, locking neck braces to prevent movement, adjustable frames to accommodate different body sizes. A version designed for public use included slots for additional restraints and a raised platform so crowds could see better. One innovation, introduced around 70 BCE, added a bell that would ring each hour the victim remained bound. An auditory countdown that made the torture competitive, measurable, something you could bet on. Records from the aediles Roman officials who managed public entertainment show that by 65 BCE, the disciplinaria was one of the most requested spectacles in Rome's smaller arenas. It was cheaper than gladiatorial combat, required no training, and the victims were plentiful. Women accused of speaking against their husbands, of refusing orders, of teaching other women to read any transgression could land them on the device, their pain transformed into a lesson for every woman watching. But something else was happening too, something the architects of this cruelty hadn't anticipated. The women who survived began to talk. In markets and temples, in the quiet corners of bathhouses, they shared what they'd endured. They compared scars. They taught each other how to breathe through the pain, how to dislocate a shoulder deliberately to ease pressure, how to disappear into their minds and return only when it was over. The device, designed to isolate and break them, accidentally created a network of resistance. By the time Christianity began spreading through Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the disciplinaria had become so commonplace that early church fathers had to address it specifically. A letter from Clement of Rome, dated around 96 CE, condemns the curved instruments of degradation and calls them an affront to God's image. But the condemnation came with a caveat. Christian women should submit to their husbands willingly, so such devices would never be necessary. The message was clear. The device itself wasn't wrong. Women's disobedience was. It took centuries for the disciplinaria to fade from use. Not because Rome became more enlightened, but because it became less fashionable. As the empire Christianized and public spectacles shifted away from torture toward martyrdom narratives, the device moved back into private spaces. By the 4th century CE, it had become a relic, occasionally mentioned in medical texts or legal arguments, but no longer widely used. Yet echoes of it persisted. Medieval Europe saw similar devices emerge: the stocks, the scold's bridle, the ducking stool, all designed specifically to punish women for speech, for defiance, for existing too loudly in a world that demanded their silence. The shape changed, but the philosophy remained. A woman's body could be sculpted into obedience if the right pressure was applied. In 1873, during excavations near the Roman Forum, archaeologists uncovered a bronze plaque buried beneath what had once been a senator's villa. The inscription, worn but legible, read, "For Julia Victrix, who taught us that laughter cannot be bound." No one knows who commissioned it or when it was placed there. But someone, perhaps centuries after her death, wanted her remembered not as a victim, but as the woman who looked at Rome's cruelest invention and refused to let it win. The last documented reference to the original device appears in a 6th century manuscript housed in the Vatican archives. A monk, transcribing older texts, includes a marginal note. The curved frame once used for discipline is now displayed in the house of Cornelius as a curiosity. Visitors are told it was used for prayer, posture. No one believes them. History tried to erase Julia Victrix. It scratched out her name, burned the records of her defiance, let her story crumble into fragments and footnotes. But the thing about laughter is that it doesn't need archives to survive. It lives in the space between cruelty and courage. In the moment when someone decides that even if they can't escape the pain, they can refuse to let it define them. Rome built a machine to torture women into silence. And somewhere in the marble ruins of that fallen empire, the echo of one woman's laughter still refuses to fade.